The wind in Dry Creek did not just blow, it scoured. It came screaming down from the jagged spine of the distant mountains, carrying sharp grit that chewed the paint off the clapboard storefronts and settled into the deep lines of men's faces. It was a town baked hard under a sun that seemed to hold a personal grudge against the earth, turning the soil into a cracked mosaic of tan and gray. By high noon, the heat rose in shimmering waves that made the horizon dance like a mirage, and the only things moving were the buzzards circling high above and the tumbleweeds trapped against the splintered railings of the boardwalks. Dry Creek sat on the edge of the frontier, a place where hope often arrived in a wagon and left in a pine box. To the west, the mountains held snow on their peaks like a cold, white threat, a reminder of the winter that would eventually kill whatever the drought missed. Coyotes prowled the outskirts as soon as the sun dipped below the rimrock, their yipping howls echoing through the empty streets like the laughter of ghosts. When night finally swallowed the valley, the town essentially vanished, save for two distinct islands of light. One was the solitary, flickering tallow candle in the window of the small, sagging church at the north end of town. The other, burning far brighter and fueling far more desperate prayers, was the golden glow spilling from the windows of the Gilded Spur Saloon. Lila moved through that golden light with the practiced grace of a woman who knew exactly how much space she took up in a room. The air in the saloon was thick enough to chew, a pungent stew of stale tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, gun oil and cheap rye whiskey. Lila cut through it, a tray of glasses balanced on one hip, her smile fixed in place like a piece of porcelain. She wore a dress of crimson silk, frayed slightly at the hem but vibrant enough to catch the eye of every man who walked through the swinging doors. The bodice was tight, pushing her breath high into her throat, and the skirt rustled with a sound that sounded like money to the saloon owner, a heavy-handed man named Silas, heavy with greasy and greed. "Here's your drink," Lila managed, setting a glass down before a bearded miner whose hands were stained permanently black with coal dust. Her voice was low, a throaty purr that she had manufactured over 5 years of living in rooms she did not own. The miner grunted, his eyes lingering on the curve of her neck. "You lookin' mighty fine tonight, Lila, worth every penny of that $2. Lila did not flinch. She had learned long ago to turn her mind off, to let her spirit float somewhere up near the rafters while her body remained below to dodge grasping hands and laugh at jokes that were not funny. "Thank you, Tom," she said, sliding away before his hand could find purchase on her arm. "Keep your winnings on the table. Not on me." She moved to the bar, her smile dropping the instant her back was turned to the room. She was 26 years old, but in the harsh light of the mirror behind the rows of bottles, she felt 100. There were bruises on her upper arm, hidden carefully beneath the puff of her sleeve. Souvenirs from a drifter who had not liked being told no 2 nights prior. Under the bar, tucked inside a cigar box where she kept her personal things, was a half-finished letter. It was addressed to a Miss Sarah Miller in Ohio. Lila sent money every month, $3, sometimes $4, along with letters that spun elaborate lies about her life as a seamstress in a bustling city, married to a kind shopkeeper. She had been a Miller once, a farm girl with dirt under her fingernails and a belief in promises. She had followed a man devoutly, a man with a silver tongue and a heart made of ash, all the way to the territories. He had abandoned her in a boarding house with a week of rent paid and not a cent more. Survival had required a shedding of her old self, layer by painful layer, until only Lila remained. She tapped her fingers on the polished wood of the bar. Another whiskey. "Silas," she said to the bartender, "and water it down. That table in the corner is getting rowdy." Reverend Jonah Hale rode into Dry Creek 3 days later, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. He was a man of 28 years, though the dust coating his black coat and the lines around his eyes made him look older. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had seen better grazing, walked with its head low, exhausted by the heat. Jonah could taste the town before he saw it. The air was dry, alkaline, and bitter. He pulled his hat lower against the glare, his hand instinctively brushing the saddlebag where his Bible sat wrapped in oilcloth. Next to the Bible, buried deep in a roll of wool socks, was a small, heavy revolver. He touched the saddlebag not for the weapon, but for the book, seeking a comfort that had been hard to come by lately. He halted his horse in front of the livery stable, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He stood for a moment, stretching legs that ached from weeks in the saddle, and looked around. Dry Creek was a place of half measures. The houses looked like they had been abandoned midway through construction. Skeletons of timber bleaching in the sun. The people he saw: a woman hanging gray laundry. A man sharpening a scythe watched him with the heavy, lidded stare of livestock evaluating a new dog. There was no welcome in their eyes, only a dull skepticism. Jonah felt that familiar hollow ache in his chest, the feeling of being too small for the task God had seemingly set before him. "Lord, make me a vessel," he prayed silently. The words habitual, but the feeling behind them jagged. Even if the vessel is cracked, the guilt was always there, a low hum beneath his thoughts. It had a face, a heavily built, angry man. A dispute over a horse in a muddy corral in Texas, a flash of iron, and the thunderous noise that ended a life. It had been self-defense. The law had said so. The sheriff had said so. But Jonah, who had been ordained only 6 months prior to the event, knew that a man of God was supposed to bring life, not end it. He had fled Texas not from the law, but from the eyes of his congregation, seeking a place so desolate that perhaps even God had forgotten to watch it closely. He found the church at the end of the street. It was a sad structure, the cross atop the steeple listing slightly to the left, as if tired. "Well, you certainly look like you have come a long way just to be disappointed," a voice said. Jonah turned to see a large man leaning against a hitching post. The man wore a suit that cost more than Jonah's horse, and a gold watch chain glinted across his vest. This was Caleb Barton, though Jonah did not know it yet. Barton's face was broad and red, fed on beef and power. "I am Reverend Hale," Jonah said, dusting off his coat. "I am here to take over the parish." Barton chuckled. "A sound like dry rocks tumbling. I am Caleb Barton. I own the mine up the ridge and most of the cattle you see starving on the plains. You are the 4th preacher we have had in 2 years. Reverend, the last one took to drink. The one before that simply got on his mule and rode south without a word." "I am not much for drinking," Jonah said quietly, "and I am done with riding." "We shall see," Barton said. He pushed himself off the post and walked closer, smelling of expensive tobacco. "A word of advice, seeing as you are new, this town is hard. People here work until they bleed, and they do not like being told they are going to hell for trying to find a little comfort." "Comfort?" Jonah asked. Barton pointed a thick finger down the street toward the saloon. "The Gilded Spur. That is where the men go, and that is where the women like Lila work. You stay away from there. Reverend, you preach your verses, bury the dead, and stay out of the business of men who are just trying to survive." Jonah looked toward the saloon. Even in the daylight, it seemed to pulse with a dark gravity. "I preach where I'm needed. Mr. Barton." Before Barton could reply, a woman in a severe gray dress approached. She walked with the stiff, militant stride of someone who believed idleness was a mortal sin. This was Mrs. Martha Pike, Mr. Barton is right, though it pains me to agree with a man who profits from vice. "Mrs." Pike said, her voice sharp as a tin whistle. "I am Martha Pike. I lead the church council. We have been waiting for a shepherd, Reverend, but we do not want one who wanders into the wolf's den." "Wolves?" Jonah asked, feeling the exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. "That saloon." "Mrs." Pike hissed. "And that woman, the one they call Lila, she is a snare of the devil, Reverend, a painted Jezebel. She has led more good men astray than whiskey itself. If you wish to do good here, you will keep the church pure and your distance from the likes of her." Jonah looked from the rancher to the church elder. One warned him to protect his power. The other warned him to protect his reputation. He nodded, tipping his hat. I appreciate the counsel. Now, if you will excuse me, I must see if this church has a roof that holds water." Jonah's first sermon, 3 days later, was delivered to a congregation of 12 people. The air inside the church was stifling, trapped heat radiating from the wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the dirty windows. He stood behind the pulpit, gripping the wood until his knuckles turned white. He looked out at the faces. Mrs. Pike in the front row, rigid as a headstone. A few minors who looked like they were hoping for a nap. A young mother bouncing a fussing baby. He had prepared a sermon on the commandments, on the rigidity of law. But looking at their tired, hardened faces, the words felt like stones in his mouth. He thought of the man in Texas. He thought of the gun in his saddlebag. He opened his Bible to a different page. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted," Jonah began, his voice rasping slightly before finding its strength, "and saves the crushed in spirit." He spoke of mercy. He spoke of the idea that a man's worst moment does not define his entire life. He spoke of second chances, his eyes scanning the room, trying to make contact with the skepticism he saw there. He saw men smirk and look at their boots. He saw Mrs. Pike stiffen, clearly thinking this message was too soft for a town this hard. Through the open doors of the church, out on the dusty steps, Lila stood. She had been walking to the general store when the sound of the preacher's voice drifted out. She didn't know why she stopped. Perhaps it was the tone, not the thundering condemnation she was used to hearing from the itinerant preachers who passed through, but something pleading, something human. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, staying just out of sight of the congregation, listening. She held a lit cheroot in one hand, the smoke curling blue against the weathered wood. Broken-hearted, she thought, a bitter smile touching her lips. Honey, if hearts were glass, this whole town would be walking on shards. She listened as Jonah spoke of grace being like water in a desert, rare, precious, and capable of bringing life to dead things. For a moment, just a fleeting second, the armor she wore around her soul cracked. She wondered what it would be like to believe that she wasn't just goods to be bought, but a soul to be saved. Then Mrs. Pike's shrill voice rose in a hymn, and the spell broke. Lila dropped the cheroot into the dust, crushed it out with the heel of her boot, and walked away, her hips swaying with a defiance she did not truly feel. The trouble started on a Tuesday night. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and silent, pressing against the earth. The gilded spur was full. The piano player was hammering out a tune that had lost its rhythm an hour ago, and the air was hazy with smoke. Jonah was walking back to the small parsonage behind the church. He had spent the evening at the bedside of the miller's son, a boy of 10 burning up with fever. Jonah had wiped the boy's forehead with cool water and prayed until the child finally slept. He felt drained, his own faith feeling like a dry well. He was passing the saloon, keeping to the other side of the street as he had been warned. When the shouting started, it wasn't the usual raucous laughter. This was the sharp, jagged sound of genuine anger. A chair crashed against a wall. Glass shattered. "You cheating tin horn!" a voice bellowed. Jonah stopped. He knew he should keep walking. He knew Caleb Barton and Martha Pike would tell him to let the sinners devour each other. But then he heard a woman scream, a high, terrified sound that cut through the wooden walls. It was the scream that moved his feet. Without thinking, without considering the gun in his own bag back at the house, Jonah turned and ran toward the swinging doors. Inside, the saloon was a tableau of violence. A card table was overturned, cards scattered like fallen leaves. In the center of the room stood a massive cowhand, a man named Grady, who worked for Barton. He was swaying, drunk and furious, waving a heavy Colt revolver. Opposite him, backing away with hands raised, was a slick-haired gambler. But Grady wasn't looking at the gambler anymore. He had turned his rage on a young barmaid named Rose, who had spilled a drink on him in the chaos. "Stupid girl," Grady roared, raising the pistol toward her. "I ought to teach you a lesson right here." Rose was frozen, her face drained of blood. Lila was behind the bar. her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been reaching for the bung starter to defend Rose when the door swung open and the preacher burst in. Jonah looked out of place in his dusty black coat, but he didn't hesitate. He stepped straight into the space between Grady and the girl. "Put the gun down." "Son," Jonah said. His voice was calm, but Lila could see the tremor in his hands. The room went silent. The piano stopped. Every eye turned to the preacher. Grady blinked, trying to focus. "You," he spat. "The preaching fool. Get out of my way." "There is no need for this," Jonah said, taking a slow step forward. "Palms out. You are angry. You have had too much to drink. Just put the iron away and go sleep it off. No one needs to get hurt tonight. You think words stop bullets?" "Preacher," Grady sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You think you're better than me? I think you are about to do something that will haunt you forever," Jonah said, his eyes locking onto Grady's. "And I am asking you not to." Grady's face twisted. He didn't lower the gun. He raised it higher, aiming it squarely at Jonah's chest. "I ain't asking you nothing," he growled. Lila saw the change in Grady's eyes. She had seen it in men before, the moment when pride overtook reason, when violence became the only way out. He was going to pull the trigger. She didn't weigh the consequences. Her hand flew to the shelf beneath the cash box. Her fingers wrapped around the cold steel of the heavy dragoon pistol Silas kept there. She lifted it, the weight of it immense in her slender hand. She didn't want to kill him. She just wanted to stop the hand that held death. As Grady's knuckle whitened, Lila fired. The boom was deafening in the enclosed space. Smoke bloomed instantly. Lila's aim was true, but her wrist was not strong enough for the recoil. The bullet flew, intending to strike the pistol from Grady's hand. Instead, it clipped his forearm, jerking his aim wide. Grady howled, dropping his gun, but the bullet did not stop. It struck the iron stove in the center of the room with a sharp ping, ricocheted at a wicked angle, and buried itself in Jonah's side. Jonah gasped. The sound punched out of him. He looked down, surprised, to see a dark stain spreading rapidly across the white of his shirt. Just above his hip, his knees unlocked, and he crumpled to the floor. Pandemonium erupted. "I'm shot!" Grady screamed, clutching his arm and scrambling for the back door, kicking over chairs as he fled. The gambler dove through a window. Men shouted, rushing for the exits, terrified of being implicated in the shooting of a preacher. Lila stood frozen for a heartbeat, the smoking gun still in her hand, the smell of cordite stinging her nose. She looked at Jonah, who was curled on the sawdust floor, clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "I shot him!" The thought screamed in her mind. "I tried to save him, and I shot him!" She dropped the gun on the bar and vaulted over the wood, her silk skirts tangling around her legs. She hit the floor on her knees beside him. "Preacher!" she yelled, her hands hovering over him, shaking uncontrollably. "Someone help him! Silas!" The room was emptying fast. Only Rose was still there, sobbing in the corner, and Silas, who was looking at the mess with a grim expression. "We can't leave him here." "Silas!" Lila snapped, her panic transforming into a frantic, sharp-edged focus. "Help me! He's bleeding bad!" "Lila!" Silas grunted. "Coming around the bar. If he dies here, Barton will hang us both." "He is not going to die!" Lila shouted, ripping the scarf from her neck and pressing it hard against Jonah's wound. Jonah groaned, his eyes squeezing shut, his face turning the color of old paper. "We have to get him upstairs," Lila said, her voice trembling. "My room. It's the only place they won't look immediately. If we take him to the doctor, the whole town will know who shot him before morning." Silas hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed Jonah's feet while Lila took his shoulders. Jonah was heavy, dead weight in his unconsciousness. They half carried, half dragged him up the narrow, creaking staircase, his boots thumping against every step. Lila's room was small, a cramped box at the end of the hall. The wallpaper was peeling in long, sun-damaged strips, revealing the rough wood beneath. There was a single narrow bed with a quilt she had stitched herself. a wash basin, and a small window that rattled as the wind outside began to pick up again. They heaved him onto the bed. Silas stood back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'll get water and whiskey," he said. "You fix this. Lila." He left, closing the door. Lila was alone with him. The preacher lay pale and still, his breathing shallow and ragged. The blood was soaking through the quilt. Lila's hands, usually so steady when pouring drinks or rolling cigarettes, were trembling so hard she could barely function. She took a deep breath, forcing the saloon girl mask to drop, leaving only the terrified woman beneath. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." She reached for the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers were slick with his blood. The intimacy of it hit her like a physical blow. Undressing a man in her bed was something she did for money, something devoid of feeling. But this was desperate and raw. She couldn't get the buttons undone fast enough. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and tore the fabric, the sound of ripping cloth loud in the quiet room. She peeled the wet cotton away from his skin. The wound was ugly. A jagged tear where the bullet had entered, just above the hip bone. It was bleeding sluggishly now, but the flesh around it was already darkening. She pressed a clean towel to the wound. Leaning her weight onto it, Jonah cried out, his eyes flying open. They were hazy, unfocused, swimming with pain. He looked up and saw her. He saw the paint on her face, the tear in her red dress, the terror in her eyes. He felt her hands on his bare skin, felt her breath hot and ragged against his ear as she leaned close to check the bleeding. "Shh," Lila whispered, her voice breaking. "You're hurt." "I shot the gun. It hit you." Jonah blinked, trying to make sense of the ceiling, the smell of lavender water and old wood. He remembered the gun. He remembered the girl. Rose. "The girl?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Is she safe?" Lila paused, staring at him. He was bleeding into her mattress, shot by her own hand, and he was asking about the barmaid. "Yes," she said. "She's safe. You stepped in front of her." Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, fixing them on Lila. They were a startlingly clear blue, even through the haze of shock. "And you," he whispered. "You stopped him. I shot you," Lila said, tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the powder on her cheeks. "I didn't mean to. I was trying to hit the gun." "You stopped him," Jonah repeated, breathless. "You saved lives." He tried to shift, but the pain pinned him down. His hand moved blindly and brushed against hers where she held the towel. His skin was burning. Lila froze at the touch. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't a demand. It was a gesture of reassurance. For the first time in years, perhaps since she left the farm, she felt someone look at her and see a human being. Not a sinner, not a commodity. Just a person who had tried to do something brave. The shame that usually coated her like a second skin peeled back for a heartbeat. "Lie still, Reverend," she said, her voice fiercely gentle. "I am going to clean this. It is going to hurt like fire." Silas returned with a bottle of cheap whiskey and a basin of water. He left them again quickly, wanting no part of the vigil. The night stretched out, long and agonizing. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the saloon, rattling the loose window pane in its frame. Dust hissed against the glass. Lila didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, washing the wound with whiskey, wincing every time Jonah flinched. She tore strips from her petticoats to bind him. As the fever took hold in the dark hours before dawn, Jonah began to mutter. He tossed his head on the pillow, sweat soaking his hair. "Don't make me do this," he mumbled, his voice thick with the Texas twang he usually suppressed. "I didn't want to kill him. Lord, he drew first. I can see his eyes. Why are his eyes open?" Lila dipped a cloth in cool water and wiped his face. "Hush now," she soothed. "You're safe. I'm not worthy," Jonah whispered, gripping her wrist with sudden, feverish strength. "The blood is on my hands. I can't preach mercy when I have blood on my hands." Lila looked down at him, at the vulnerability etched into his face. He was broken, just like everyone else in this godforsaken town. The holy man had his own ghosts. She didn't pull her hand away. She let him hold on to her, an anchor in his storm. "You are worthy enough to bleed for a stranger," she whispered to the sleeping man. She sat there as the candle burned low, the shadows stretching across the peeling wallpaper. She was a saloon girl with a ruined reputation, and he was a preacher with a secret. But in that small, battered room, while the wind tried to tear the town apart outside, they were just two people keeping each other alive. Dawn arrived in Dry Creek not with a burst of glory, but as a pale, bruised gray that seeped through the cracks in the window frame. The wind had finally died down, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the peeling wallpaper of the small room above the saloon. Reverend Jonah Hale woke by degrees, dragged from a fevered darkness by the sharp, throbbing ache in his side. For a moment, he lay motionless, staring at a ceiling stained with water rings that looked like old maps of forgotten countries. He blinked, the grit of sleep in his eyes, confusion clouding his mind. This was not the parsonage. The air here did not smell of beeswax and old paper. It smelled of lavender water, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of dried blood. He turned his head, a movement that sent a spike of white-hot pain through his ribs, causing a sharp hiss of breath to escape his teeth. There, in a wooden chair pulled close to the bed, she slept. Lila. Her head was tipped back against the hard wood, her throat exposed, pale and vulnerable in the gray light. Her hair, usually pinned up in the intricate, severe style demanded by her trade, had come loose, spilling over her shoulders in a dark, tangled cascade. She looked younger like this, the painted mask of the saloon girl softened by exhaustion. A heavy wool cloak was draped over him, and he realized with a flush of heat that was not from the fever that he was lying in her bed. Beneath her sheets, he was a man of God, and he was in the bed of a woman the town called a harlot. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He tried to sit up, panic flaring in his chest, warring with a profound, confusing sense of gratitude. The movement was too sudden. He groaned, the sound unintentional and low. Lila woke instantly. There was no slow transition from sleep to wakefulness. Her eyes snapped open, alert and guarded, the instinct of a woman who had learned that surprises were rarely kind. She saw him struggling to rise and was out of the chair in a heartbeat. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice raspy with sleep but firm. "You will tear the stitches." She reached out, her hands hovering for a split second before pressing against his shoulders to ease him back against the pillows. Her palms were warm, her fingers strong. The contact was electric, a sudden, grounding connection that froze them both. Jonah looked up at her, his blue eyes wide and startled. Lila looked down, her breath catching in her throat. It was too intimate. It was the touch of a wife or a lover, not a stranger, and certainly not a saloon girl tending to a preacher. She pulled her hands back as if she had been burned, retreating a step. "You are awake," she said, crossing her arms over her chest, the defensive wall slamming back into place. "I was not sure you would be. You were burning up half the night." Jonah swallowed, his throat dry as dust. I remember. The gun. The fight. You stepped in front of a bullet," Lila said flatly, which was a foolish thing to do. "Reverend, I remember you," Jonah said softly. "You saved me." Lila looked away, staring at the window where the light was strengthening, turning the gray to a harsh, unforgiving white. "I shot you." "Let us not confuse the matter. You aimed for the gun," Jonah insisted, wincing as he shifted his weight. "I remember that too. You saved that girl. You saved me from a direct hit." Lila did not answer. She moved to the wash basin, pouring water from a pitcher. The splash was loud in the quiet room. She wrung out a cloth and brought it to him, her face composed now, the professional mask slipping back into place. "You need to leave," she said, handing him the cloth, "before the town wakes up fully. If anyone sees you coming down those stairs, they will talk." Jonah finished, wiping his face. The cool water felt like a blessing. "They will do more than talk," Lila said grimly. "They will skin us both with their tongues." Jonah nodded. He pushed the blanket aside. He was wearing his trousers, but his shirt had been cut open, hanging in bloody tatters. His chest was wrapped in white linen, stark against his skin. He felt a deep, burning shame, not just for the impropriety, but for the weakness. He was supposed to be the shepherd, the strong one, and here he was, broken and being tended to by the very sheep he was told to condemn. He tried to stand, his legs trembling like a newborn foal's. The room spun lazily. He gripped the bedpost, his knuckles white. Lila watched him, her hands twitching at her sides. She wanted to help him, but she was afraid to touch him again. The spark she had felt earlier terrified her more than the anger of the town. "Here," she said, grabbing his black coat from the back of the chair. "Put this on. It will hide the bandages." She held it out for him. Jonah turned, sliding his arms into the sleeves with a grunt of pain. He tried to button the coat, but his fingers were clumsy, shaking with exhaustion and shock. He fumbled with the middle button, missing the hole twice. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Lila muttered. She stepped forward, brushing his hands aside. She began to do the buttons herself, starting from the bottom. Her head was bent, her concentration intense. Jonah stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. He could smell the scent of her, faded lavender water, the smoke of the saloon, and something underneath that was just clean. Warm skin. Her knuckles grazed his stomach, his chest. It was a utilitarian act, yet it felt dangerously tender. When she reached the top button, near his throat, she paused. Her eyes lifted. Meeting his, they were inches apart. He could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the fine lines of fatigue at the corners. "Thank you." "Lila," he whispered. She stepped back quickly, the moment breaking like a snapped twig. "Go out the back," she said, her voice tight. "Through the kitchen. The alley leads behind the livery. Keep your head down." Jonah nodded. He picked up his hat, which had been retrieved from the saloon floor, dusty and battered. He paused at the door, looking back at her. She stood in the center of the cramped room, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the debris of his medical care, looking small and defiant. "I will not forget this," he said. "Just go, Reverend," she replied. Turning her back to him, he slipped out the door, the floorboards groaning under his boots. Lila listened to his uneven, limping footsteps fade down the hall. When silence returned, she sank onto the edge of the bed where he had lain, pressing her hand to the spot where his head had rested. It was still warm. An ache bloomed in the center of her chest, a hollow, hungry thing. She knew, with a certainty that tasted like ash, that the town would never believe he had been here for anything other than sin, and for the first time in years, she wished, with a desperate, foolish heart, that the world was different. Jonah moved through the back alley, the dust swirling around his boots in little devils. The morning air was cold, biting at his exposed neck. He kept to the shadows, limping heavily, one hand pressed against his side to brace the wound. He made it to the parsonage unseen, or so he thought. But Dry Creek was a town of eyes, eyes that peered through cracked shutters, eyes that watched from behind hanging laundry, eyes that missed nothing. Misses. Gable saw him stumbling near the livery. Old Man Miller saw him clutching his side, and the stable boy, Billy, saw him coming from the direction of the saloon alley, looking like he had been dragged behind a horse. The rumors did not just spread, they ignited. They jumped from porch to porch like a prairie fire. By the time the sun was high enough to bake the mud into brick, the story had mutated. "Did you hear? The preacher was at the saloon all night, drunk as a lord. They say, fighting over a girl. Not just a girl. Lila, the one with the red dress. I heard she shot him. A lover's quarrel. No, he shot someone else for her honor. Can you imagine? A man of God, brawling like a common drunkard." The story's twisted, fed by the boredom and the harsh judgment of people who had little else to entertain them. By noon, Jonah was not a victim of a ricochet while saving a soul. He was a fallen man who had been ensnared by the devil's own bride. Sunday service, 3 days later, was an exercise in tension. Jonah stood at the pulpit, pale and sweating, his side bandaged tightly beneath his shirt. Every breath was a labor, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the atmosphere in the room. The pews were fuller than usual, but not with the faithful seeking the word. They were full of the curious, the judgmental, the vultures coming to see the carcass. Mrs. Martha Pike waited until the final amen had barely faded before she struck. She marched up the aisle as the congregation filed out, her face set in a mask of sweet, poisonous concern. She wore a hat with a stiff black feather that bobbed as she walked, looking like an accusatory finger. "Reverend Hale," she said, her voice loud enough to halt the people lingering near the door. "We must speak." "Mrs. Pike," Jonah said, gripping the edge of the pulpit to steady himself. "The council is distressed," she began, folding her gloved hands. "We are not blind. Reverend, we know this is a harsh land, and a young man has needs, but the Lord's servant cannot be entangled with the devil's daughters." Jonah straightened, ignoring the stab of pain in his side. "Mrs. Pike, if you are referring to the incident at the saloon, you have been misinformed." "Misinformed?" she echoed, a thin smile stretching her lips. "You were seen leaving her quarters at dawn. You were shot in a brawl in a house of iniquity. Is this untrue?" "I went there to stop violence," Jonah said, his voice rising slightly. "I was wounded in the process. Miss Lila, the woman there, she saved my life. She offered me Christian charity when I could not walk. Christian charity." "Mrs. Pike scoffed. "From a woman who sells herself by the hour? Do not blaspheme. Reverend, that woman is a snare, and you have walked right into the trap. If you wish to remain the shepherd of this flock, you will cleanse yourself of this filth. We will not have a preacher who reeks of cheap perfume and whiskey." She turned on her heel and marched out, the black feather trembling with indignation. Jonah watched her go, feeling a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his wound. He was not given a moment to recover. As he stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, Caleb Barton was waiting for him by the hitching post. The rancher was whittling a piece of wood with a long, curved knife, the shavings falling onto his polished boots. "Rough sermon." "Reverend," Barton said without looking up. "Mr. Barton," Jonah said wearily. "I will keep this brief," Barton said, snapping the knife shut. "I put a lot of money into this town. I built the bank, I built the hotel, and I pay for the roof over your head. I do not pay for scandals." "It was not a scandal," Jonah said. "It was an accident." "It is a scandal if I say it is," Barton said, looking up finally, his eyes hard and flat like river stones. "Men in this town look to me. If I say the preacher is compromised, then the preacher starves. You stay away from the saloon. You stay away from that girl. You focus on preaching about hard work and obedience, and let the men of this town handle their own vices. Do we understand each other?" Jonah looked at the powerful man. Seeing the threat veiled as advice, "I answer to God. Mr. Barton, not to your bank ledger." Barton laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "God isn't the one signing your stipend checks. Son, be smart. Down at the Gilded Spur." The atmosphere was no better. If Jonah was facing the judgment of the righteous, Lila was facing the cruelty of the sinners. Silas was in a foul mood. The mirror behind the bar was cracked from the fight, and he had spent the morning sweeping up glass. "You are bad for business." "Lila," he grumbled as she walked in for her shift. "Preachers bring nothing but guilt and lawmen. I don't want him in here again. I didn't invite him." "Silas," Lila snapped, tying her apron. The cowhands were worse. They had heard the rumors, and they found them hilarious. "Look who it is," one shouted as she carried a tray of beers. "The preacher's pet." "Hey, Lila," another called out, grabbing at her skirt. "Do I need to read a Bible verse to get you upstairs? Or is cash still good enough?" Laughter rippled through the room, crude and sharp. Lila kept her face frozen, her chin high. She slapped the hand away. "Cash is fine," she said, her voice like ice. "But for you, the price is double, because I have to listen to you speak." The men laughed harder, but the sting was there. She moved through the room, feeling the eyes on her differently now. Before, they had looked at her with lust. Now, they looked at her with a mix of lust and mockery, as if her interaction with the preacher had made her an even bigger joke. "She thinks she's better than us now," their eyes said. But she's just trash. She retreated to the back room to refill the salt shakers, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the tray against the wall. "You were brave." The whisper came from the shadows. Lila turned to see Rose, the young barmaid, standing near the door. Rose looked terrified, twisting her apron in her hands. "What?" Lila asked, her voice softening. "You saved him," Rose whispered. "And you saved me. When Grady pointed that gun, I thought I was dead. You were brave, Lila, no matter what they say." Lila felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at Rose, so young, so unhardened, and felt a fierce, protective urge. She sniffed, brushing a non-existent speck of dust from her sleeve to hide her emotion. "I just didn't want the carpet ruined. Rose," she said, trying to sound tough, "but thank you." She walked back out into the saloon, clutching Rose's small kindness like a lifeline in a hurricane. 2 days later, Jonah did the unthinkable. It was 10 in the morning. The sun was a white disk in the sky. The saloon was quiet, the lull between the morning drunks and the evening rush. The doors were propped open to let the air circulate, and the dust motes danced in the thick beams of light that cut through the gloom. Lila was scrubbing a table near the window. She wore a simple calico dress she used for chores, her hair tied back in a messy braid. She was humming a tune she remembered from her childhood, trying to scrub away a sticky ring of bourbon. The light in the doorway was blocked. Lila looked up, expecting Silas or a delivery boy. It was Jonah. He stood there, framed by the bright street, looking like a shadow that had detached itself. He was wearing his black coat, though it looked brushed and mended now. He held his hat in his hands. Lila froze, the rag dripping dirty water onto the floor. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low. "I had to come," Jonah said. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking. The transition from the bright street to the dim interior made him blink. "Are you trying to get run out of town?" Lila asked, dropping the rag into her bucket. "Mrs. Pike will have a stroke if she sees you crossing this threshold in daylight." "Let her," Jonah said. He walked toward her, his limp less pronounced but still there. He stopped across the table from her. The smell of soap and old wood hung between them. "I never thanked you properly," he said. "Not when I was in my right mind." "You thanked me enough," Lila said, scrubbing a spot on the table that was already clean. "You are alive. That is thanks enough." "It is not," Jonah said. His voice was steady, stripping away her defenses. "I remember your hands, Lila. I remember you sitting in that chair all night. You could have left me to the doctor. You could have thrown me out, but you didn't." Lila stopped scrubbing. She looked up at him. The blue of his eyes was piercing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You are a preacher. I am what I am. You coming here just makes it harder. For both of us. I am a man who owes you his life," Jonah said. "And I am tired of people speaking ill of the woman who saved me." He reached across the table. His hand, calloused from riding and work, covered hers. Lila gasped softly. His skin was warm. The touch was firm, devoid of the grasping greed she was used to. It was a touch of respect. "God has not forgotten you, Lila," Jonah said, his voice thick with emotion. "You think you are lost. You think this room is all there is. But I saw you. I saw the courage in you. That is not the spirit of a devil's bride. That is the spirit of a woman who deserves more." Lila stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a moment, the saloon faded. The dust, the smell of whiskey, the shame, it all fell away. There was only him, and the way he looked at her as if she were precious. "You don't know me," she whispered, but there was no heat in the words. "I know enough," Jonah said. He squeezed her hand. "And if anyone says otherwise, if anyone insults you because of me, I will set the record straight. I promise you." Their hands lingered. The moment stretched, fragile and terrifyingly beautiful. The air between them hummed with a tension that was not just gratitude. It was the magnetic pull of two lonely souls recognizing each other in the dark. "Hey, we open for business?" Or is this a prayer meeting? The voice shattered the moment. A miner stood in the doorway, blocking the light. Jonah pulled his hand back quickly. Lila snatched hers away, plunging it back into the soapy water. Just cleaning up. Tom, Lila said, her voice sounding high and brittle. Jonah put his hat on, his face flushing. Good day. Miss Lila, he said formally. Good day. Reverend, she replied, not looking at him. He walked past the miner, head high, but his heart was racing. Lila watched him go, her hand burning where he had touched it. The rumors did not stop. They darkened. By evening, the story was that the preacher had been seen holding the saloon girl's hand, his face soft as butter. Men laughed about it in the livery. Women whispered about it over fences. The scandal was becoming a legend. On Sunday, the church was packed. Even the miners who usually slept in on Sundays were there. They wanted to see the show. Jonah stood at the pulpit. He looked tired, but his eyes were burning with a strange, fierce light. He did not preach about the laws of Leviticus. He did not preach about hellfire. He opened his Bible to the book of John. He spoke of the Samaritan woman at the well. He spoke of a woman who had had 5 husbands, a woman the world had discarded, a woman who came to the well at noon to avoid the judgment of her neighbors. Jesus did not condemn her. Jonah's voice rang out, bouncing off the rough-hewn beams. He did not ask for her references. He did not check her reputation with the town elders. He offered her living water. He spoke to her as a person worthy of truth. The congregation shifted uneasily. Mrs. Pike sat rigid, her lips a thin white line. Barton looked bored, checking his pocket watch, but many of the others looked down at their hands. There is no soul in this town beyond grace, Jonah said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried to the back of the room. Not yours, not mine, and certainly not the souls of those we cast out because it makes us feel righteous to look down on them. Outside, in the shadow of the church wall, Lila stood. She was pressed against the rough wood, out of sight. She could hear every word. She heard the tremor in his voice. She heard the defense he was mounting, not just of the woman in the Bible, but of her. No soul is beyond grace. She closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, a cracking of the numbness she had cultivated for so long. A single tear slipped out, hot and fast. She wiped it away angrily, but she did not leave until the final hymn began. That night, the wind was down, and the sky was a vast, inverted bowl of obsidian scattered with diamond dust. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Lila went to the well behind the church. It was the only place to get sweet water. The saloon's water always tasted of iron. She carried a wooden bucket, the handle creaking in the silence. She was winding the rope, listening to the bucket splash far below, when she heard a twig snap. She spun around, hand going to the small knife she kept in her boot. "It is only me," a voice said. Jonah stepped out from the shadow of the oak tree. He was without his coat, standing in his shirt sleeves, the white fabric luminous in the starlight. "You have a habit of sneaking up on people, Reverend," Lila said, letting out a breath. "And you have a habit of being out in the dark," Jonah replied softly. He walked closer. The dry grass whispered around his boots. He stopped a few feet from her. The air was cold, crisp enough to see their breath in small, ghostly puffs. "I heard you today," Lila said, "outside the church." Jonah paused. "You were there? I listen sometimes. It's cheaper than buying a ticket to a show?" Jonah smiled, a faint, fleeting thing. "It wasn't a show. Lila, I meant every word. I know you did." She said, "That is what scares me." "Scares you? Why?" "Because you actually believe it," she said, her voice dropping. "You believe in second chances. You believe people can be washed clean, but you don't know what it's like to be stained so deep it's in the grain. You can't scrub this off. Jonah," she gestured to herself, to the invisible mark the town had placed on her. Jonah stepped closer. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I killed a man, Lila," he said quietly. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and shocking. Lila stared at him. "What?" "In Texas," Jonah said, looking up at the stars. "It was self-defense, but I took a life. I watched the light go out of his eyes. I carry that stain every time I open the Bible. I feel like a fraud every time I preach about mercy." He looked back at her, his gaze intense and vulnerable. "We are all stained. Lila, the only difference is some of us hide it better. You wear your scars on the outside, but that doesn't make you less. In some ways, it makes you more honest." Lila felt her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that terrified her. He was stripping himself bare before her, handing her his shame to match hers. "You shouldn't tell me that," she whispered. "I could ruin you with that." "But you won't," Jonah said, "because you are not who they say you are." He reached out, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered on her jawline. His skin was rough, warm, and terrifyingly real. Lila stopped breathing. She looked up at him, at the curve of his mouth, the darkness of his eyes. The attraction that had sparked in her room flared now into a flame. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a hunger to be close to the only person who saw her. His face was inches from hers. She could smell the soap on his skin, the faint scent of old paper. She saw his eyes drop to her lips, then back up to her eyes, filled with a conflict that mirrored her own. "Jonah," she breathed, the name feeling strange and right on her tongue. He leaned in, just a fraction. The space between them was charged, heavy with the promise of a kiss that could destroy everything he had built and everything she was protecting. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that broke the spell. Jonah pulled back, blinking as if waking from a trance. He cleared his throat, stepping back into the safety of the shadows. I should let you get your water," he said, his voice ragged. "Yes," Lila said, gripping the cold handle of the bucket until her fingers hurt. "You should. Good night." "Lila, good night." "Jonah." He turned and walked back toward the parsonage, disappearing into the dark. Lila stood alone by the well, the water bucket forgotten, her hand rising to touch the spot on her cheek where his fingers had rested. The cold night air felt suddenly feverish. She was terrified. She was thrilled. And for the first time in a long time, she was not numb. The heat that descended on Dry Creek that month was not merely a weather event. It was a judgment. The sun rose each morning like a hammered copper shield, radiating a dry white heat that sucked the moisture from the soil and the patience from the soul. The creek, usually a reliable trickle, retreated into a series of stagnant, mosquito-clouded pools on the outskirts of town. The carcasses of cattle bloated in the sagebrush, their ribs pressing against hide like barrel staves. Too far gone even for the coyotes. In the mines, the air grew thick and unbreathable. Men coughed up black phlegm that tasted of sulfur and despair. The dust was everywhere. It gritted between teeth, settled in water barrels, and coated the pews of the church in a fine gray shroud. When men are scared and hungry, they look for a reason. And when they cannot find a reason in the sky or the earth, they look for a scapegoat among themselves. Mrs. Martha Pike found her reason in the Book of Numbers and the Book of Leviticus. She stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, a black-clad crow in a world of brown dust, holding court with the women of the town. It is plain as the nose on your face. "Mrs." Pike declared, her voice carrying over the dry wind. "The Lord does not strike a land without cause. We harbor a den of iniquity in our midst. We let the whores dance while the cattle die. We let a preacher consort with the devil's own, and we wonder why the rain does not fall." The logic was simple, brutal, and infectious. It gave the town a target that was flesh and blood, something they could drive out, unlike the sun. Reverend Jonah Hale tried to stem the tide on Sunday, facing a congregation that was sweating and irritable. He wiped his brow with a damp handkerchief and gripped the pulpit. "Friends," he said, his voice hoarse, "the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, and the drought does the same. This hardship is the nature of the West. It is a test of our endurance, not a specific punishment for the sins of a few. We must look to our own hearts. not throw stones at our neighbors. He looked out at them, searching for agreement. He saw only stony faces. To them, his theology sounded weak. It sounded like an excuse. It sounded like a man protecting his sin, soft on sin. A man muttered in the back row. That is what he is. Caleb Barton watched this growing resentment with the calculating eye of a man who knew the value of a distraction. The mine was failing. The veins were thinning out, and the supports in the lower tunnels were rotting, creaking ominously with every shift. The men were talking about strikes. They were talking about safety. Barton needed them talking about something else. He invited Mrs. Pike and 3 of the town's angriest deacons to his ranch house. He poured them lemonade in crystal glasses and spoke in low, grave tones about the moral fabric of Dry Creek. "I fear you are right, Martha," Barton said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I have been too tolerant. I thought business was just business, but I see now that the spiritual rot is spreading. If the church is willing to lead a campaign, a holy cleansing, if you will, I will finance it. We need to rid this town of vice." He did not mention that ridding the town of vice would keep the men too busy hunting sinners to notice they were working in a death trap. He did not mention that he owned the land the saloon stood on and could evict them legally if he chose, but preferred the spectacle of a moral crusade. The check he wrote to the church fund was substantial. The violence began 3 nights later. It was a Tuesday, usually a quiet night, but the heat made the air feel volatile, like a room filled with gas waiting for a match. A group of 12 men gathered at the livery. They were miners and ranch hands, fueled by Barton's whiskey and Pike's rhetoric. They carried axe handles and heavy leather belts. They told themselves they were soldiers of God. They stormed the Gilded Spur at 9 o'clock. The double doors burst open with a crash that shattered the glass panes. "Get out!" one of the men roared. "This den of filth is closed." They did not wait for compliance. They began to smash. A chair was hurled into the mirror behind the bar, bringing it down in a glittering avalanche of shards. Bottles were swept off the shelves, the smell of cheap rye and bourbon filling the air instantly. Lila was near the piano when they burst in. She froze, a tray of empty glasses in her hands. She saw the violence in their eyes. It wasn't the drunken brawl of a Saturday night. This was cold, self-righteous, and terrifying. "Get the girls back," Silas shouted, reaching for his shotgun. But a miner swung a pick handle and knocked the weapon from his grip, sending Silas sprawling. Rose screamed as a man grabbed her by the wrist, dragging her toward the door. "You are leaving this town, girl." Lila dropped the tray and launched herself at the man. She was smaller, but she was fueled by 5 years of suppressed rage. She clawed at his face, raking her nails down his cheek. "Let her go!" Lila screamed. The man howled and released Rose, backhanding Lila across the face. She stumbled back, tasting blood, but she grabbed Rose and shoved her behind the heavy oak bar. "Stay down," she ordered. The saloon was a maelstrom of destruction. Tables were overturned. The piano player fled out the back. Then Jonah was there. He had been in his study, writing a letter to the bishop asking for guidance. When he heard the crash, he ran down the dusty street, his coattails flying, breathless and terrified. He burst through the doors and saw the chaos. He saw the men he had preached to on Sunday smashing the livelihood of the people he had tried to save. "Stop it," Jonah bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain. "In the name of God, stop this madness!" He grabbed the arm of a man raising a chair to smash a window. The man spun around. It was Tom, the blacksmith, a man who usually sat in the third pew. "Reverend," Tom sneered, his face flushed with heat and zeal. "You best step aside. We are doing the Lord's work. You are doing the devil's work." Jonah shouted, shoving the man back. "You are attacking women. You are destroying property. Is this the mercy of Christ?" "Mercy?" another man jeered. "Look at him. Look how he defends his harlot." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The destruction paused for a heartbeat as the mob turned its attention to the preacher. "She is a human being," Jonah cried, placing himself between the mob and the bar where Lila and Rose were crouched. You are cowards, all of you. A man stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at Jonah. She has bewitched you, preacher. We all see it. You spend your nights in her bed and your days preaching soft lies to us. She dragged you down to hell, and you went willingly. She shot a man, someone shouted from the back, and now she has the preacher on a leash. Lila stood up slowly from behind the bar. Her lip was split, bleeding a bright red line down her chin. She looked at the mob, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. I shot a man to save him, Lila said, her voice cutting through the noise. Which is more than any of you hypocrites have ever done. Listen to her, the ringleader shouted. The devil's bride speaks. The phrase caught. It was perfect. It fit the narrative Mrs. Pike had spun. Devil's bride, another man yelled. Devil's bride. The chant rose up, ugly and rhythmic. Jonah stood his ground, his face pale, his arms spread wide to shield her. Get out, he ordered, his voice trembling with a fury he had never known. Get out before I bring the marshal. The men, having smashed enough to satisfy their bloodlust for the night, began to retreat. But they did not leave defeated. They left laughing, spitting on the floor, chanting the name they had coined, Devil's Bride. Lila stood amidst the broken glass and spilled whiskey, the name echoing in her ears like a curse. Jonah turned to her, reaching out a hand, but she flinched away, her eyes wide and haunted. The name did not fade with the morning. It grew. It appeared in chalk on the water trough. It was whispered in the queue at the general store. On Sunday morning, Jonah arrived at the church early to prepare the altar. He stopped dead at the front doors. Pinned to the weathered wood was a piece of parchment. It was a crude charcoal sketch, drawn by a hand that had more anger than talent. It depicted a woman with exaggerated horns and a long, forked tail. She held a leash, and at the end of the leash was a man in a preacher's collar, crawling on all fours like a dog. Beneath it, in jagged letters, The Devil's Bride and Her Pet. Jonah felt a heat rise in his face that burned hotter than the sun. It was not just anger, it was a profound, sickly shame. He tore the paper from the door, crumbling it in his fist until his nails cut into his palm. He preached that morning with a cold, trembling fury. He held the crumpled ball of paper in his hand the entire time. When the service ended, he did not stand at the door to shake hands. He walked straight to Mrs. Pike, who was gathering her hymnal. Did you see this? Jonah demanded, uncurling his fist to show the wrinkled drawing. Mrs. Pike looked at it, her expression unreadable. I saw it, Reverend, and you left it there? For the children to see? Mrs. Pike shrugged, a small movement of her stiff shoulders. It is crude, yes, but sometimes, Reverend, the truth stings. Perhaps if you did not give them so much canvas, they would not paint such pictures. Jonah stared at her, realizing that there was no charity in her heart, only a calcified righteousness. He turned and walked out of the church, leaving her standing there. He walked straight to the saloon. He did not care who saw him. The saloon was quiet, the windows boarded up with fresh pine planks where the glass had been shattered. Jonah knocked on the back door. Lila opened it. She looked tired. The bruise on her cheek had turned a dark purple, blooming like a storm cloud against her pale skin. She saw the look on his face and stepped back to let him in. He followed her up the stairs to her room. It was the first time he had been back since the shooting. The room was the same, peeling wallpaper, the narrow bed, the scent of lavender, but the air felt heavier now. Jonah closed the door and leaned against it. He looked at her, at the bruise, at the weary slump of her shoulders. I am sorry, he said, his voice breaking. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirt. For what? Jonah? The weather? The glass? For this? Jonah said. He walked over and placed the crumpled drawing on the small table beside her wash basin. Lila picked it up. She smoothed it out with trembling fingers. She looked at the caricature of herself, the horns, the leash. She looked at the depiction of him, degraded and animalistic. She let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a brittle sound, like glass snapping. They didn't get my nose right. She said, Lila, please. Jonah said, sinking onto the wooden chair. Do not joke. What else am I supposed to do? Lila asked, looking up at him. If I don't laugh, I will scream. And if I start screaming, I don't think I will ever stop. She dropped the paper. I have been called a whore. Jonah, I have been called a slut, a jade, a piece of meat. I have been called things that would make your ears burn. But this is different, Jonah said. Yes, Lila said softly. This is different. Because those other names, they were just about me. They were about what men did to me. This drags you down into the mud with me. She looked at him, her eyes filling with sudden tears. I told you that you couldn't scrub this off. You tried to be kind, and now they have painted you as a dog on a leash. I do not care about my reputation, Jonah said fiercely. I care, Lila cried, standing up. I care that the one decent man I have met in 5 years is being destroyed because he was foolish enough to help me. They stood facing each other in the small room, the air vibrating with the things they had not said. You are not a burden, Jonah said, standing up to meet her gaze. You are the only thing in this town that feels real to me. Lila shook her head, tears spilling over. You don't know what it's like, to be passed from hand to hand like a coin. To have men look at you and calculate your worth in minutes. I am tired. Jonah, I am so tired of being something to be used. I know about being unworthy, Jonah whispered. Lila stopped, looking at him. I told you I killed a man, Jonah said, his voice dropping to a murmur. But I didn't tell you why. It wasn't just a fight. It was over a horse. Yes, but I was angry. I was proud. When I pulled that trigger, for a split second, I wanted him dead. I enjoyed the power of it. He took a step closer to her. I stood over him and watched him die, and I felt satisfied. That is the sin I carry. That is why I came here. I thought if I went to the edge of the world, I could outrun the man I was. But I can't. I am just as broken as you are. Lila, maybe more, because you sell your body to survive. I sold my soul for a moment of pride. The confession hung between them. Lila looked at him, seeing not the holy man, but the man beneath, the flawed, hurting human being. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. She wiped away a tear that had escaped his eye. We are a pair, aren't we? She whispered. The killer and the whore. Jonah covered her hand with his. He turned his face into her palm, closing his eyes. The intimacy was overwhelming. It was not the intimacy of the bedroom, but the intimacy of the confessional, of two soldiers in a trench. He opened his eyes. Her face was inches away. Her lips were parted, her breath hitching. He leaned in. She leaned in. The world outside, the mob, the heat, the drawing, ceased to exist. There was only the pull of gravity between them. Their lips were a breath apart. Jonah could feel the warmth of her mouth. He wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted to pray. He wanted to lose himself in her, to find absolution in her touch. Then he jerked back. The reality of who he was, of the collar he wore, of the promise he had made to God, slammed into him. He was a coward. He was afraid that if he crossed this line, he would never come back. I cannot, he stammered, backing away. Lila stood frozen, her hand still raised in the air. Then she dropped it. She let out a sharp, jagged laugh, turning away to hide the humiliation burning her face. Of course, she said, her voice hard and bright. Of course you can't. A saint can't kiss a devil's bride. It's against the rules. Lila, that is not go. Jonah, she said, her back to him. Just go, before you think of another reason to pity me. Jonah stood there for a moment, torn apart. Then he turned and left, closing the door softly. Lila stood in the center of the room, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the wash basin to stand. The room felt colder than it ever had before. The end came 3 days later, at dusk. The sky was a violent, bloody red, the sun setting behind the dust clouds in a display of apocalyptic color. The heat had not broken. The tension had snapped. Caleb Barton had decided that the campaign needed a climax. The whispers were not enough. The drawings were not enough. He needed an example. He sent 4 of his biggest ranch hands to the saloon. They didn't bother breaking anything this time. They just went for her. They dragged Lila out the front door, kicking and screaming. Her dress tore at the shoulder. One of her shoes came off, leaving her bare foot to scrape against the rough boardwalk. "Bring her to the forge," a man shouted. A crowd gathered instantly. It was as if they had been waiting for this. Men, women, even children, drawn by the spectacle of violence. They dragged her down the main street to the blacksmith's shed. The forge was already lit, glowing with a dull, malevolent orange heat. Tom, the blacksmith, stood by the anvil, looking pale but resolute. Mrs. Pike stood on the porch of the general store, watching with arms crossed. Barton watched from his office window. They threw Lila into the dirt in front of the forge. She scrambled to her knees, coughing in the dust, her hair wild around her face. "Please," she screamed, looking at the wall of faces. "Please, I have done nothing to you. We are marking you for what you are," a man yelled. "You want to be a devil's bride? We'll give you the ring." Tom pulled a branding iron from the fire. It was a simple bar brand, usually used for cattle. The tip glowed a cherry red. "Hold her," someone commanded. 2 men grabbed Lila's arms, pinning her to the ground. She thrashed, screaming, her heels digging into the dirt. The heat of the iron radiated against her skin as Tom stepped forward. "Mark her!" the crowd chanted. "Mark her!" Jonah heard the screams from the church. He did not run this time. He sprinted. He flew down the street, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the crowd. He saw the glow of the iron. He saw Lila pinned in the dirt, her face a mask of sheer terror. He didn't think. He didn't speak. He hurled himself through the crowd, knocking people aside like skittles. Just as Tom lowered the iron toward Lila's shoulder, Jonah dove. He slammed into the blacksmith, knocking the iron wide. It hissed as it hit the dirt inches from Lila's face. Jonah scrambled up, placing himself over Lila, shielding her body with his own. He faced the mob, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "You will have to go through me," he screamed. "If you want to burn her, you burn me first." For a second, the mob hesitated. It was the preacher. Then someone threw a stone. It struck Jonah in the forehead, cutting the skin. Blood trickled down into his eye. "He's chosen his side," a voice roared. "Get him!" The mob surged forward. They fell on Jonah like a pack of wolves. Fists rained down on him. Boots kicked at his ribs, his back, his legs. Jonah did not fight back. He curled himself around Lila, taking the blows, making himself a human shield. "No!" Lila screamed, trying to push up, trying to cover him. "Stop it! You're killing him!" She took a kick to the shoulder that numbed her arm. She clawed at the legs of the men, biting, scratching, sobbing. The dust swirled around them, choking and thick, mixed with the metallic smell of blood. Jonah groaned with every impact, but he did not let go of her. He held her head against his chest, whispering a prayer she couldn't hear. Bang! The gunshot echoed like a cannon blast. The mob froze. They looked up to see the town marshal, an old man named Holloway, who usually tried to stay out of Barton's business, standing on a wagon with a smoking rifle. "That is enough," Holloway shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "Step away, or the next one goes into a belly." The mob wavered, then slowly backed away, panting, their knuckles bloody. They left Jonah and Lila lying in the dirt. The sun had set. The light was fading into a bruised purple. The branding iron lay cooling in the dust, a black, twisted snake. Jonah lay motionless, his face a ruin of blood and dirt. Lila crawled out from under him. She was weeping, a raw, guttural sound. She touched his face, her hands leaving streaks of red on his pale skin. "Jonah?" she whispered. "Jonah, please." He opened one eye. It was swollen shut, but the other looked at her, hazy and full of pain. Did they burn you?" he wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. "No," Lila sobbed, cradling his head in her lap. "No, you stopped them." "Good," Jonah whispered, his head lolling back. Good. The crowd dispersed, melting back into the shadows, some looking back with shame, others muttering. They had not branded her skin. But as Lila looked down at the broken man in her arms, and then up at the hateful, silent town, she knew the mark was there anyway. They were both branded now. The devil's bride and her fallen priest. And the scar would never fade. The ascent to the room above the saloon was a journey of inches. Lila was not a large woman, and Jonah, though lean, was dead weight in his battered state. She half carried, half dragged him up the narrow staircase, her boots slipping on the worn treads. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Jonah groaned low in his throat, a sound that vibrated against her ribs where she had his arm draped over her shoulder. She kicked the door of her room open and practically collapsed with him onto the bed. The frame groaned under the sudden weight. Lila stood there for a moment, hands on her knees, gasping for air. Her lungs burned, and her arms trembled so violently she could barely unclench her fists. The room was dim, the shadows stretching long and thin like skeletal fingers. Outside, the town was quiet, the silence of a predator that had just eaten its fill. Lila moved. She lit the kerosene lamp, her hands shaking so much the flame danced wildly before settling. She turned to Jonah. He was a ruin. His face was swollen, one eye completely shut, a cut on his forehead oozing slow, dark blood. His shirt was torn to ribbons, revealing the mottled purple bruising already blooming across his ribs. Lila felt a surge of rage so hot it nearly blinded her. It was a physical thing, a coil of fire in her gut. She cursed, a stream of profanity she had learned from miners and mule drivers. Words that would have made Mrs. Pike faint dead away. She cursed the town. She cursed the drought. She cursed Caleb Barton and his money. And mostly, she cursed herself. She stripped the ruined shirt from him, wincing as the fabric stuck to dried blood. She poured water into the basin, water that was lukewarm and stale, but it was all she had. She tore up her last good petticoat for bandages. "You stupid, stubborn fool," she hissed under her breath as she dabbed the wet cloth against the cut on his head. Jonah flinched. His good eye fluttered open. It was hazy, swimming with pain and confusion, but it found her face. "Lila?" he croaked. His voice was a wreck, like gravel grinding together. "Hush," she snapped, dipping the cloth again. "Don't speak. You will just break something else." Jonah tried to shift, to sit up, but a spasm of pain slammed him back against the mattress. He let out a sharp breath. I failed," he whispered. Lila froze. She looked down at him, the rag dripping water onto the floorboards. "Failed? I meant to. Protect you," Jonah rasped. "I wanted to stop them, but they—" He trailed off, shame twisting his battered features. He looked away, staring at the peeling wallpaper. "I brought them down on you. I made it worse." Lila dropped the cloth into the basin. The splash was loud in the small room. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. Her grip was hard, fueled by the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "You look at me. Jonah Hale," she said, her voice fierce and low. "Do you see a brand on my shoulder? Do you see burned skin?" Jonah blinked, trying to focus. "No." "Then you didn't fail," she said. She let go of his chin, her hand trembling. "They were going to mark me like cattle. They were going to burn that name into my flesh so I could never take it off. You stopped that. You threw yourself on the iron." Jonah looked at her, the realization sinking in through the fog of pain. "But look at you," he whispered. "You are hurt." "I have been hurt before," Lila said, turning away to wring out the cloth. "A bruise fades. A burn does not." She went back to cleaning his ribs. Her touch, despite the harshness of her voice, was incredibly gentle. She traced the line of a rib that was likely cracked, her fingers light as a feather. Jonah watched her. He saw the streaks of tears cutting through the face paint she wore. He saw the tremor in her lower lip that she was trying desperately to bite still. "Why did you do it?" Lila asked suddenly, her voice cracking. "Why did you jump in? No one does that. Not for me. I could not watch them hurt you," Jonah said simply. Lila stopped. She stared at the water in the basin, watching it turn pink with his blood. Men don't stand between me and pain. Jonah, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They never have. They stand aside, or they are the ones holding the whip. My father, the man who brought me west, Silas, they all watch. They calculate the cost and they step back. She looked up at him, and the dam broke. The toughness she wore like armor shattered. Tears welled up and spilled over, hot and fast. You are the first, she sobbed, the first man who didn't step back. Lila, Jonah murmured. He reached for her. It was an instinctive movement, born of a need to comfort that overrode his own pain. His hand caught her wrist. She stiffened, her old instincts flaring, the instinct to pull away, to protect herself. But then she looked at him. She saw the open, bleeding honesty in his face. She crumbled. She sank onto the edge of the bed and leaned forward, burying her face in the curve of his neck. Jonah wrapped his arms around her. It hurt to move, it hurt to breathe, but he held her. He felt her hot tears against his skin. He felt the racking sobs that shook her small frame. He stroked her hair, tangled and dusty, murmuring soft, nonsensical words of comfort. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound in the room the wind rattling the window pane and the harsh, wet sound of her weeping. When Lila finally pulled back, she was exhausted. She wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing the coal around her eyes. I am sorry, she said, sniffing. I look a fright. You look beautiful, Jonah said. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Lila froze. She looked at him, searching for the lie, for the transactional flattery she was used to. She found none. Jonah looked back at her. The pain in his body was receding, replaced by a different kind of ache. A heat was spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with fever. He was aware, suddenly and sharply, of the softness of her arm against his, of the scent of her hair, lavender and smoke, filling his senses. The room felt very small. The walls seemed to press in, pushing them closer together. They sat in silence for a while, the tension thrumming between them like a taut wire. Do you think? Jonah started, then stopped. What? Lila asked softly. Do you think a man like me can still speak for God? He asked. After tonight, I felt rage, Lila. When I saw them holding you, I wanted to kill them. I didn't want to pray for them. I wanted to break them. That sounds like a man, not a preacher, Lila said. Maybe they are the same thing, Jonah said. Or maybe I am just broken. You are not broken, Lila said fiercely. You are the only whole thing in this town. Mrs., Pike, Barton, they are the broken ones. They have forgotten how to feel. She took his hand. Her fingers were cool. His were warm. She traced the knuckles, swollen and bruised. And me, she asked, looking down at their joined hands. Can a person like me ever be more than a name? The devil's bride? Jonah shifted his hand so his palm pressed against hers. He threaded his fingers through hers, locking them together. God does not call you by the names men give you, he said. He knows your true name. And so do I. He ran his thumb over the tender skin of her inner wrist. Lila shivered. It was a small touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark, dilated in the dim light. The pain, the fear, the adrenaline. It was all mixing into a potent, heady brew. Jonah. She breathed. He leaned in. This time, he did not pull back. Their lips met. It was hesitant at first. A question asked in the dark, a brushing of skin, soft and terrified. Then Lila made a small sound in her throat, a sound of need, and the dam broke for him too. Jonah groaned and deepened the kiss. It wasn't the chaste, polite kiss of a suitor. It was hungry. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and iron and whiskey. He brought his hand up to cup her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. She clutched his shirt, pulling him closer, careful of his ribs but needing to feel the solidity of him. It was a kiss that poured out everything they had been holding back. The loneliness of the prairie, the cruelty of the town, the fear of death, and the terrifying, forbidden hope of love. They clung to each other like drowning sailors finding a spar in a storm. Then, slowly, Jonah pulled back. His breathing was ragged. His forehead rested against hers. He whispered, his voice trembling. I have never wanted anyone, as much as I want you right now. Lila opened her eyes. They were wide, luminous in the lantern light. I am scared. Jonah, she whispered. I am too, he admitted. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. Not of the town. I'm scared because when you touch me, it doesn't feel like a transaction. It feels like you want me, not just a body, and I don't know what to do with that. Jonah kissed her forehead. A soft, lingering pressure. You don't have to do anything, he said. Just let me be here. They did not go further. The weight of the moment was too heavy. The shift in their world too seismic to rush. They sat on the narrow bed, leaning against the headboard, shoulders pressing together. Jonah held her hand, his thumb stroking her skin in a rhythmic, soothing motion. Lila rested her head on his uninjured shoulder. They fell asleep like that, sitting up, fully clothed, entangled in a way that was more intimate than any act of lust could ever be. Morning brought a cold, hard reality. Jonah woke stiff and aching, every bruise singing a chorus of pain, but the space beside him was warm. Lila was already up, moving quietly around the room. He went to the church first, limping heavily. He found the doors locked. A note was nailed to the wood, written in Mrs. Pike's jagged, angular script. Reverend Hale, until a formal inquiry can be held regarding your conduct and fitness for the ministry, the council suggests you take a leave of absence. The parsonage remains yours for the week, but the pulpit is closed to you. Suspended, effectively fired. He walked to the general store to buy flour and coffee. Mrs. Gable, usually a chatterbox, turned her back on him when he entered. The clerk served him in silence, placing the change on the counter rather than in his hand, as if his touch were contagious. It was worse for Lila. She tried to go to the market. Women crossed the street to avoid her, gathering their skirts and pulling their children close. Don't look at her, Billy, one woman hissed loudly. That's the woman who bewitched the preacher. She carries a sickness. Men were bolder. A group of Barton's cowhands were lounging on the boardwalk. Hey, devil's bride, one shouted. Does the preacher pay in prayers or silver? Why don't you come over here and show us what you taught him? Another jeered. Lila kept her head high, her eyes fixed on the horizon. But inside, she was shrinking. The name was sticking. It was becoming her skin. She returned to the saloon, trembling. Rose met her at the back door, her face pale. Lila, Rose whispered, pulling her into the storeroom. You have to leave. What? Lila asked, setting down her basket. I heard them, Rose said, tears standing in her eyes. I was sweeping near the office. Barton was talking to Tom. They said the saloon is a blight. They said an accident might happen. A fire. Lila, tonight or tomorrow. They want to burn it down to get rid of you. Lila felt the blood drain from her face. A fire in this wind? It would take the whole block. I have to go, Lila whispered. If I stay, I am just a target, and I will get everyone else killed. She ran upstairs and began to pack her meager belongings into a carpet bag. Her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't fold her dresses. Jonah found her there an hour later. He saw the open bag. He saw the panic in her eyes. You are running, he asked, standing in the doorway. They are going to burn the place down. Jonah, Lila cried, throwing a hairbrush into the bag. Rose heard them. Barton is going to torch the saloon to drive me out. I can't let Silas or the girls burn for me. Then we stop him, Jonah said calmly. Stop him? Lila laughed, a high, hysterical sound. How? You are a disgraced preacher and I am the town pariah. We have no power. Jonah! We have the truth, Jonah said. He walked over and took the bag from her hands. Barton isn't doing this just because of morals. Lila, he is doing it because he needs a distraction. What are you talking about? The miners, Jonah said. I spoke to a few of them this morning, men who were too ashamed to join the mob. They said the mine is a death trap. Barton is cutting supports to save money. He is terrified they will strike or talk. That is why he is whipping up this frenzy against you. If everyone is looking at the Devil's Bride, no one is looking at the rotting beams in Tunnel 4. Lila stared at him. So I am just smoke? You are the scapegoat, Jonah said. But if we can prove what he is doing, if we can show the town that he is risking their sons and husbands for profit, his power breaks. It is dangerous, Jonah, Lila said. So is running, he countered. Running just admits they are right. He took her hands. Stay. Fight this with me. Lila looked at him. She saw the bruising on his face, the steady light in his eyes. She took a deep breath. Okay, she whispered. We fight. They waited until dusk. The town was busy with the evening meal, the smell of wood smoke and frying bacon hanging in the air. They skirted the edge of town, moving through the brush until they reached the base of the ridge where Barton's mine sat. It was a dark wound in the hillside, surrounded by piles of tailings and rusted machinery. They crept closer, hiding behind a stack of timber. The entrance was guarded by one man, but he was asleep, a bottle of whiskey by his feet. They slipped inside the main tunnel. It was cooler here, but the air was stale and tasted of copper. Jonah lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. They walked deep into the earth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water. Look, Jonah whispered, holding the light up. The main support beams were old, sodden with water. They bowed in the middle. Worse, in several places, new beams that should have been installed were missing entirely, replaced by hasty, makeshift shoring that looked like it would snap under a heavy breath. It's a tomb, Lila whispered, horror cold in her stomach. And look at the shifts, Jonah said, pointing to a tally board nailed to a post. He is working these men 16 hours. And here, names of boys. Billy Miller. He is 12 years old. We have to tell them, Lila said. They turned to leave, but as they emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the twilight, they found they were not alone. Caleb Barton was waiting for them. He sat on his horse, flanked by 3 of his men. He held a riding crop, tapping it rhythmically against his boot. I wondered when you would come poking around, Reverend, Barton said smoothly. You are a monster, Jonah said, stepping in front of Lila. That mine is a collapse waiting to happen. You are sending men to their deaths. Business is complicated, Barton said with a shrug. But trespassing? That is simple. We're going to tell the town, Lila said, her voice shaking but loud. We saw the beams. We saw the tally board. And who will believe you? Barton sneered. The whore and the heretic? You think the town will take your word over mine? I am the pillar of this community. You are the filth in the gutter. He rode closer, his horse snorting. I could have you arrested right now, Barton said, for trespassing, for industrial sabotage. Or maybe I just tell the town that I found the 2 of you up here, engaged in lewd acts in the dark. That fits the story better, doesn't it? Jonah stepped forward, fury radiating from him. You touch her, and I will kill you. Barton laughed. Listen to him, the man of God. You are done. Hail. I'm going to give you one choice. You leave town by sunrise, both of you. If you are still here tomorrow, I will have the sheriff arrest the girl for solicitation and you for aiding her. And in my jail, accidents happen. He wheeled his horse around. Sunrise, Reverend, or I burn you both down. He rode off, his men following, leaving Jonah and Lila standing in the dust, the weight of the threat pressing down on them like the mountain itself. They could not go back to the saloon. It wasn't safe. They could not go to the parsonage. They walked to the edge of town, to an old trapper's cabin that had been abandoned years ago. It sat near the creek bed, hidden by a stand of cottonwoods. The door hung on leather hinges. Inside, it smelled of dry pine needles, old dust, and mice. Jonah hung the lantern on a rusty nail. The light cast a warm, golden circle in the gloom, pushing back the shadows. Lila sat on a dusty crate, wrapping her arms around herself. She was shivering, though the night was not cold. "He wins," she whispered. "We have to go, Jonah. He owns the law. He owns the town." Jonah paced the small dirt floor. He kept running his hand through his hair. "I cannot let him win," he muttered, "but I cannot let him hurt you." He stopped and looked at her. She looked so small in the dim light, her dress torn, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes were fierce. She was a survivor. He walked over and knelt in front of her. "We will decide in the morning," he said. Right now we are alive, and we are together." Lila looked at him. The fear began to recede, replaced by something else. Something she had felt sparking in her room. Something that had been building since the moment he stood between her and the gun. "We are together," she repeated softly. The world outside, Barton, the mine, the mob, seemed to fade away. There was only the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods and the steady hiss of the lantern. Jonah reached out and cupped her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "I am not leaving you, Lila," he said. "Not tomorrow, not ever." Lila leaned into his touch. She covered his hand with hers. "Then don't leave me tonight," she whispered. Jonah stood up, pulling her with him. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the heat of his body, solid and real. He kissed her. This was not the hesitant kiss of the night before. This was sure. It was a claim. It was a promise. Lila kissed him back with everything she had. She tangled her hands in his hair, pulling him closer. She wanted to be close enough to forget the world, close enough to blur the lines between them. The kiss deepened, growing urgent. Jonah's hands moved to the small of her back, pressing her to him. Lila's hands moved to the buttons of his coat. There was no shame this time. There was no hesitation about propriety. There was only the desperate need to affirm life in the face of so much darkness. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist. He carried her to the pile of blankets in the corner of the cabin. The lantern burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound, but inside the circle of light, there was warmth. They came together not as saint and sinner, but as two people who had found the only sanctuary that mattered in each other's arms. The darkness of the cabin became a confessional, and their closeness a prayer without words. Later, much later, the lantern flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. They lay side by side on the rough blankets, covered by Jonah's coat. The silence was profound. Lila lay with her head on Jonah's chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She traced the line of the scar on his shoulder with her fingertip. "Jonah," she whispered into the dark. He murmured, his arm tightening around her. "I'm not afraid anymore." Jonah kissed the top of her head. "Neither am I." They lay there, staring up at the cracks in the roof where the stars peeked through. They knew that sunrise would bring danger. They knew Barton was waiting. They knew the town would brand them forever if they stayed. But as Jonah held Lila close, his hand resting protectively over hers, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was done running. He was done apologizing for who he loved. "We stay," he whispered to the darkness. "We stay and we fight." Lila squeezed his hand. "We stay." And in the quiet of the abandoned cabin, with the weight of the world waiting outside the door, they slept, fiercely and stubbornly together. The morning broke not with the promise of light, but with a heavy, suffocating gray. The sky was a low ceiling of leaden clouds that scraped the tops of the distant peaks, veiling the mountains as if the world were drawing the curtains on a tragedy. Lila left the abandoned cabin first. She slipped out while the shadows were still long and deep, wrapping her shawl tight against the biting chill that had replaced the sweltering heat of the week prior. She did not look back at the small, listing structure where her life had irrevocably changed. She could still feel the warmth of Jonah's skin against hers, a ghost sensation that made the cold air sting all the more. Every step toward the town felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge of what she had done and the terrifying, fragile hope she now carried. Jonah left 20 minutes later. He walked the perimeter of the town, coming in from the north to avoid being seen near the creek. His conscience, usually a clear bell ringing with the certainty of Scripture, was now a cacophony. He walked with the limp that was becoming a part of him, his body aching from the beating and the loving. A physical map of the last few days. Part of him, the part that had been trained in seminaries and raised on the strict milk of the law, screamed that he had fallen. He had taken a woman who was not his wife, a woman the town called a harlot, and he had found comfort in her arms. But another part, a quieter, fiercer part, that felt more like the God he spoke of, told him that last night was the most honest prayer he had ever offered. It had been an act of shelter, not consumption. He entered the church through the back door. The sanctuary was empty, the air cold and smelling of old hymnals and dry pine. He walked to the altar, but he did not kneel. He stood, gripping the rough wood of the communion rail, looking up at the wooden cross that hung slightly askew. "I do not ask for forgiveness," Jonah whispered into the silence. "I cannot ask forgiveness for loving her. I only ask for strength. If I am to stand beside her in the fire, Lord, make me fireproof, or at least, let me burn long enough to shield her." The answer came not from heaven, but from the earth. A low rumble shook the floorboards beneath his boots. It was not an earthquake. It was thunder, deep and rolling, signaling the end of the drought with a violence that felt personal. By noon, the sky tore open. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge. Water fell in sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked through the gaps in the buildings. The parched, cracked earth of Dry Creek could not drink it fast enough. The dust turned instantly to a slick, sucking mud that grabbed at wagon wheels and boots. The dry gullies became torrents of brown water, foaming and churning as they raced toward the river. Jonah was in the parsonage, boarding up a window that the wind had cracked. When he heard the bell, it was the church bell, but it was ringing with a frantic, uneven rhythm. Clang, 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 clang! Disaster. Jonah dropped his hammer and ran out into the storm. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his shirt to his chest. He saw people running toward the edge of town, toward the ridge. He grabbed a man running past, the baker, Mr. Henderson. "What is it?" Jonah shouted over the roar of the wind. "The mine," Henderson yelled, his face pale and streaming with water. "The lower tunnels. The creek burst its banks and it is pouring right into the shaft." Jonah felt a cold pit open in his stomach. He turned and ran. He found Lila already there. She was standing near the mine entrance, her hair plastered to her skull, her dress soaked and heavy with mud. She was staring at the dark maw of the mine, her hands clamped over her mouth. Jonah reached her, grabbing her shoulders. "Lila! Jonah!" she screamed, her voice thin against the wind. "They are inside." The shift had just started. The scene at the mine entrance was pure chaos. The water from the overflowing creek was cutting a new channel, rushing straight down the slope and cascading into the main ventilation shaft. It looked like a waterfall disappearing into the throat of the earth. Caleb Barton was there, on his horse, shouting orders to his foreman, but he wasn't ordering a rescue. "Seal it!" Barton roared, pointing to the main timber supports of the entrance. "Collapse the entrance! We have to stop the water or the whole mountain will come down and I will lose the vein!" "You cannot!" Jonah shouted, shoving his way through the cluster of terrified miners. "There are men down there. They're already dead," Barton yelled back, his eyes wild with the panic of a man watching his fortune dissolve. "If the water hits the main support pillars, the whole mine collapses. We have to seal it to save the infrastructure." "You would bury them alive to save your tunnels?" Jonah screamed. He turned to the men standing around, miners holding pickaxes, looking uncertain and terrified. "Are you going to let him do this?" Jonah demanded, his voice cutting through the storm. "That is your brothers down there. That is your sons." Barton spurred his horse forward, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. "Get back, preacher. This is business." "It is murder," Jonah countered. A woman burst through the crowd. It was Mrs. Miller. Her face was gray, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended language. My Billy, she wailed, throwing herself at the foreman's feet. My Billy is down there. He is only 12. You cannot seal it. The sound of her grief broke the spell Barton held over the men. The miners looked at the weeping woman, then at the flooding shaft, and finally at Barton. We ain't sealing it. Caleb, the foreman said, spitting into the mud. We are going in. Barton looked around. He saw the shift in the eyes of the townsfolk. He saw the mothers, the wives, the men who had been drinking his whiskey for years now looking at him with hatred. He realized his power had a limit, and he had just reached it. Fine, Barton spat. Go in, but if the roof comes down, do not blame me. Anyone who enters does so at their own risk. I wash my hands of it. Jonah did not wait. He grabbed a lantern from a stunned miner. Who's coming? He shouted. I am, said a large man named Swedish Olaf. And me, said Tom the blacksmith, looking ashamed as he met Jonah's eye. And me. The voice was small but steady. Jonah turned. Lila was standing there, shivering, but her jaw was set. No, Jonah said, stepping toward her. Lila. No, it is dark. It is tight. I know. I am going, she said, cutting him off. I know those boys. Jonah, I bring them water when they sneak out for breaks. I am not staying up here. She grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope. Her hands were trembling violently, but she did not drop them. Jonah looked at her for a second, seeing the terror behind her eyes, the old terror of the locked room, the helplessness she had fought all her life, and he saw the courage that was conquering it. Stay close to me, he said. They descended into the earth. The air inside the mine changed instantly. The roar of the storm was muffled, replaced by a heavy, wet silence broken only by the sound of rushing water somewhere below them. The air was thick, smelling of wet rock, sulfur, and unwashed bodies. The light from their lanterns bobbed erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like specters on the rough-hewn walls. Lila felt her chest tighten. The walls seemed to be breathing, pushing in on her. The memory clawed at her throat. The storage room at the Golden Slipper, where the owner had locked her for 3 days for refusing a customer. The darkness, the smell of her own fear. She stopped, gasping, her hand clutching her throat. Lila! Jonah's voice was right beside her ear. Low, steady, I can't, she whispered, shaking. The walls. Look at me, Jonah commanded. He took her free hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, squeezing hard enough to ground her. Don't look at the walls. Look at the light. Look at my back. I am right here. I will not let the dark take you. She looked at him, focusing on the blue of his eyes in the lantern light. She took a ragged breath. She nodded. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They moved deeper. The water was already ankle-deep on the main level, cold and black. They found the first group of men near the junction of Tunnel 2. 3 of them were injured, pinned by a small rock slide. Help us, one man croaked. My leg. I think it is broke. Jonah and Swedish Olaf worked to lift the heavy stones, grunting with the effort. Lila fell to her knees in the mud, tearing strips from the hem of her dress to bind the crushed leg. Her hands were swift and sure, her saloon girl training in patching up bar fight victims coming into play. You are going to be fine. Hank, she told the groaning man, wiping mud from his face with her sleeve. We are getting you out. They loaded the injured men onto the backs of the stronger rescuers. Go, Jonah ordered. Get them to the surface. We will go deeper for the others. The group split. Jonah, Lila, and Tom pushed on toward the lower levels, where the water was rising fast. The tunnel grew narrower here. The timber supports groaned under the weight of the sodden earth above. Every creak sounded like a gunshot. They were moving past a section of shoring that looked particularly rot-eaten when the mountain gave a warning. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the tunnel. Look out, Jonah yelled. He did not think. He threw himself sideways, shoving Lila hard. She flew backward, landing in the mud just as a massive wooden beam sheared off and slammed into the ground where she'd been standing. Jonah was not fast enough to clear it completely. The end of the beam clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him flat. Debris rained down, rocks, dirt, splinters. "Jonah!" Lila screamed. The sound was swallowed by the earth. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp rocks cutting her skin. The dust was thick, choking. She found him trying to push himself up, his face gray with pain. He was clutching his right shoulder, his arm hanging at an odd angle. "I'm all right," he gasped, though his eyes were squeezed shut. "Just winded." Lila grabbed his good arm. "Get up, preacher," she hissed, hauling him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "We are not dying in this hole." Jonah gritted his teeth and stood, leaning heavily on her. "Thank you," he wheezed. "We are even," she said, her voice shaking. "Now move." They reached the end of the line, a small pocket of air at the bottom of the shaft. The water was waist-deep here, swirling and cold. Huddled on a ledge, shivering and clinging to each other, were 5 boys. They were the slate pickers, the youngest of the crew. Among them was Billy Miller. They were crying, their small lanterns long since burned out. "Reverend?" Billy's voice was a high, terrified squeak in the dark. "It is us, Billy," Jonah called out, his voice booming with a confidence he did not feel. "We are coming." They waded through the water. It was freezing, numbing their legs instantly. Jonah reached the ledge and began lifting the boys down, handing them to Tom. One boy, a tiny kid named Jem, was frozen with fear. He wouldn't let go of the rock. "I can't swim," Jem sobbed. "I have got you, sweetheart," Lila said, wading forward. She lifted the boy into her arms, settling him on her hip as if he were her own. "The mountain isn't going to have you, Jem, not today." They turned to head back, but the way they had come was blocked. The collapse that had hit Jonah had brought down more of the ceiling. The tunnel was sealed. "No," Tom groaned. "No, God, no." "Wait," Jonah said, holding up his light. "There, the ventilation drift." He pointed to a small, jagged hole near the roof of the tunnel. It was an old air shaft, narrow and tight, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through on his belly. "It leads to the upper level," Jonah said, "but we have to crawl." Lila stared at the hole. It was a throat of stone, dark, tight, crushing. Panic slammed into her chest like a sledgehammer. Her vision swam. "No, not that. Anything but that. Lila," Jonah said. "I can't." She gasped, backing away, the water splashing around her. "I can't go in there. Jonah, I will die. I will stop breathing. Lila, listen to me." Jonah grabbed her shoulders with his good hand, shaking her slightly. "The water is rising. If we stay here, we drown. These boys drown." He looked deep into her eyes, ignoring the chaos around them. "You are the bravest woman I know," he said fiercely. "You stood down a mob. You stood down a gun. You can do this. I will be right behind you. I will be holding your ankle the whole way. I promise." Lila looked at the hole, then at Jem, who was clinging to her neck, burying his face in her muddy hair. She looked at Jonah, seeing the absolute faith in his eyes. She closed her eyes, took a breath that tasted of wet grave dirt, and nodded. "Go," she whispered. Tom went first, dragging the bigger boys. Then Jonah pushed the smaller ones through. Then it was Lila's turn. She pulled herself up into the narrow darkness. The rock pressed against her back. The roof scraped her nose. It was a coffin of stone. She started to hyperventilate, the air wheezing in her throat. "Calm down, calm down." Then she felt it. Jonah's hand, warm and solid, wrapping around her ankle. "I am here," his voice echoed from behind her. "Keep moving, Lila, 1 inch at a time, toward the light." She focused on his hand. She focused on the boy. Jem, crawling ahead of her. She dragged herself forward, scraping her elbows, her knees, her soul. It felt like hours. It felt like a lifetime of crawling through the dark. And then, gray light. They spilled out of the ventilation shaft onto the upper level, gasping, muddy, and alive. They were near the entrance. They stumbled out into the storm. The rain was still falling, but it felt clean now. It washed the mud from their eyes. A cheer went up from the crowd gathered at the entrance. A ragged, wet, joyful sound. "There they are. They emerged like creatures born of the earth. Jonah, clutching his broken shoulder, face gray with pain. Lila, dress torn to rags, mud caked in her hair, carrying little Jem in her arms. Tom bringing up the rear with the other boys. Mrs. Miller broke through the line, screaming her son's name. Billy ran to her, and they collapsed in the mud. The townsfolk stared. They saw the devil's bride and the fallen preacher, covered in filth, shivering in the cold rain, delivering their children from the grave. The silence that followed the cheer was profound. It was the silence of shame. It was the silence of a town realizing how wrong it had been. Caleb Barton stood near the foreman's shack. He looked at the survivors. He saw the way the town was looking at Jonah and Lila, not with judgment, but with awe. He tried to salvage it. He stepped forward, raising his voice. "You see," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "Reckless. I told them it was dangerous. Hale endangered us all by delaying the seal. And that woman, enticing men into a condemned hole for heroics." His voice rang hollow. It sounded tinny and weak against the reality of the saved boys. "Shut your mouth, Caleb." "Mrs. Miller said, standing up. She looked at the rancher with eyes hard as flint. "Just shut your mouth before I shut it for you." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deep, grinding roar echoed from the mountain, louder than the thunder. The mine entrance behind them groaned, the main timbers snapping like twigs. With a massive whoosh of displaced air and dust, the entrance collapsed completely. The mountain had claimed its due. The crowd gasped. Stepping back, Barton went pale. He stared at the pile of rubble that blocked the entrance. His eyes darted around the survivors. "Where is Seth?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Where is my nephew?" The foreman took off his hat, the rain running off the brim. "He was on the pump crew. Caleb, they were deep, near the sump." Barton stared at the sealed tomb. "No," he whispered. He is just a boy." The mask cracked. The arrogance, the bluster, the greed. It all fell away, leaving a terrified old man who realized that the earth did not care about his bank account. He collapsed to his knees in the mud, staring at the rocks. Lila handed Jem to his mother. She looked at the collapsed mine, then at Barton. Her heart, despite everything, ached for the loss. She took a step toward the rubble. Maybe there is another way in. The vent shaft. I can go back. Jonah's hand clamped onto her arm. "No," he said. His voice was rough, exhausted, and final. "Jonah, there might be—" "No." "Lila." Jonah pulled her back, turning her to face him. His good hand cupped her face, smearing mud on her cheek. "The vent is gone. Listen to the rumble. It is done." He looked into her eyes, and she saw the raw, naked fear there. "I cannot lose you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I watched you crawl into that dark, and I thought I would die of fear. We have done all we can. We are not throwing our lives away now. Not when we finally have them." Lila looked at him. She saw the love in his face, fierce and protective. She slumped against him, the adrenaline finally leaving her, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "You are right," she whispered. The rain continued to pour, washing the blood from Jonah's forehead and the mud from Lila's arms. It could not wash away the scars, or the memory of the dark, or the branding of the town. But it didn't matter. Around them, people were beginning to move. A miner's wife came forward and draped a blanket over Lila's shoulders. A man offered Jonah a flask. They were small acts, silent apologies. But Jonah and Lila were not looking at the town. They were looking at each other, standing in the sucking mud, battered, bleeding, and shivering. They exchanged a look that was more powerful than any sermon or any vow. It was a look of shared survival. It was the look of two people who had walked through hell together and come out the other side, still holding hands. "We are still here," Jonah whispered. "Yes," Lila answered, leaning her head against his chest. "We are still here." The days following the storm were quiet, as if the town of Dry Creek had shouted itself hoarse and now had no voice left. The floodwaters receded. leaving behind gullies scoured deep into the red earth and fences toppled like pile of kindling. The streets were a quagmire of sucking mud that plastered boots and wagon wheels alike. But the air felt different. The oppressive heat was gone, washed away by the deluge, and in its place was a crisp, clear stillness that carried a strange mix of grief and possibility. People moved slower. They looked each other in the eye less often, but when they did, the gaze was softer. The tragedy of the mine had cracked the town open, exposing the rot beneath the surface, but also revealing the bedrock of shared humanity that had been buried under fear and greed. Jonah and Lila stayed in the small trapper's cabin for 2 days, not out of shame, but out of necessity. The parsonage had a broken window and a flooded cellar, and the saloon was a boarded-up shell. It was on the 3rd morning that the visitors started coming. They did not come in a crowd. They came singly, or in pairs, creeping up the muddy path to the cabin like shy deer. Mrs. Miller came first. She brought a loaf of sourdough bread, wrapped in a clean towel, still warm from the oven. She stood at the door, twisting her apron in her hands, looking at Lila. "For the boy, Mrs." Miller said, her voice thick. "For bringing my Billy out." Lila, who had faced down drunkards and mobs without flinching, felt her throat close up. She took the bread, the warmth of it seeping into her cold fingers. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller," she whispered. Later, a miner's wife brought a jar of preserved peaches, the glass glowing like amber in the gray light. A man whose brother had been dug out of the rubble left a heavy wool blanket on the step without a word, simply nodding to Jonah before walking away. Lila sat at the rough table, staring at the jar of peaches. She was shaking. "I don't understand," she said to Jonah. "They don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would do. They are not used to kindness that doesn't come with a bill." "Lila," Jonah said, slicing the bread, "and neither are you." The reckoning for Caleb Barton happened in the town hall on a Thursday. It was not a court of law. There was no judge within 200 miles. But it was a hearing of the people, presided over by the town marshal and a council of elders. The hall was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, their hats in their hands, the smell of damp wool and tobacco filling the room. Barton sat at a small table in the front. He looked smaller than he used to. The bluster was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He kept smoothing his vest, as if trying to flatten out the wrinkles of his reputation. The testimony was damning. One by one, miners stepped forward. They spoke of the rotting beams in Tunnel 4. They spoke of the foreman threatening to dock their pay if they took time to shore up the roof. They spoke of the boys, the slate pickers who were listed on the books as 18 but were barely 12. Jonah spoke last. He stood tall, his arm in a sling, the bruise on his face fading to a sickly yellow. He did not shout. He did not preach. He simply laid out the facts. "Greed is not a crime in the statute books." "Perhaps," Jonah said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "But negligence is, Mr. Barton gambled with human lives to save the cost of timber, and when the wager went bad, he tried to seal the tomb rather than save the men inside." Lila sat in the very last row, hidden in the shadows of the doorway. She had not been summoned. She knew her voice would not carry weight here, but her presence was a weight in itself. Every time a person turned and saw her, pale, quiet, watching, they were reminded of the mob, of the branding iron, of the fact that the woman they had called a devil had shown more godliness in the dark than the town pillar had shown in the light. Some glared at her, their prejudice too deep to be washed away by one rainstorm. But others, men who had screamed for her blood just a week ago, looked at their boots when they passed her. The judgment, when it came, was imperfect. This was the West, and money still held the high ground. Barton was not jailed, but he was stripped of sole control over the mine's safety operations. A committee of miners was established to approve all structural work, and he was ordered to pay restitution, $500 to the family of each man who died, and $50 to the injured. It was a heavy blow to his fortune, but a mortal blow to his pride. As the meeting broke up, Barton walked out. He passed Jonah. He stopped, his face twisting with a mix of hatred and defeat. "You think you won, preacher," Barton hissed. "But you are still a disgraced man, and she is still a whore. Money grows back. Reputations do not." Jonah looked at him calmly. "I would rather have a ruined reputation and a clean soul, Mr. Barton, than a mountain of gold and the blood of children on my hands. Mrs. Martha Pike did not give up easily. She cornered Jonah the next day outside the general store. She looked stiff, her black dress unyielding, her face set in lines of grim disapproval. "I will admit," Mrs. Pike said, sniffing, "that I was mistaken about the mine. Mr. Barton deceived us all." She paused, waiting for Jonah to absolve her. He remained silent. "However," she continued, her voice hardening, "that does not change the other matter. You have fallen into scandal. Reverend, you have consorted with that woman. You have spent nights in her company without the sanction of marriage. The town is talking." "Let them talk," Jonah said. "It is untoward." "Mrs. Pike insisted. "If you care about the church, you will step down. You cannot lead a flock when you are wallowing in the mud with the lost sheep." Jonah looked at the church steeple, rising stark against the blue sky. "You are right. Martha," he said. "Mrs. Pike blinked, surprised. "I am. I cannot preach in the old way," Jonah said. "I cannot stand up there and pretend I am better than the people in the pews. I cannot talk about sin as if it is something only other people do." He looked back at her, his eyes clear and steady. "But I will not step down. If I speak of God from now on, I will speak as a man who knows what it is to be flawed. I will speak as a man who knows that sometimes the holiest thing you can do is love someone the world calls unworthy. And if the congregation does not want to hear that, they can lock the doors. But I will not leave, Mrs. Pike opened her mouth, closed it, and then turned on her heel, marching away with the stiff indignation of a general who has lost the war but refuses to surrender the parade ground. The rumors did not stop, but they changed flavor. They became less about scandal and more about curiosity. "Did you see them?" people whispered, walking down Main Street, bold as brass. Jonah and Lila began to be seen together openly. It was a small thing, but in Dry Creek, it was a revolution. Jonah would carry a sack of flour on his good shoulder. Lila would walk beside him, not trailing behind like a servant, but right at his elbow. She wore a simple dress she had mended herself, her hair pulled back plainly. She held her head high. It unsettled people. It forced them to reconcile the devil's bride with the woman who bought apples and smiled at the baker. One evening, a month after the storm, Jonah asked Lila to walk with him to the old cabin. The cottonwoods were turning gold with the coming autumn, their leaves rustling like paper coins in the breeze. Inside the cabin, Jonah had swept the floor and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers in a jar on the table. Lila looked at the flowers, then at him. "What is this?" "Jonah." Jonah took her hands. His palms were sweating. He felt more nervous now than he had facing the mob. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to listen before you say no." Lila went still. "I am listening." Jonah took a breath. "I want to marry you." Lila pulled her hands back as if stung. "Jonah, I want my life tied to yours," he said, stepping closer. "For as long as we have breath, I do not want to hide in cabins. I do not want to walk you to your door and leave. I want to wake up beside you and know that we are facing the world together." Lila turned away, walking to the window. She looked out at the darkening sky. "You are a fool," she whispered. "A sweet, wonderful fool. Do you know what that will do to you? A preacher marrying a saloon girl? The town will never accept it. I will be a millstone around your neck. You will be the man who married the devil's bride. I will ruin you." Jonah crossed the room and turned her to face him. "You saved me," he said fiercely. "You didn't ruin me." "Lila, you saved me from a life of hollow righteousness. You taught me what grace actually looks like. I don't want a life the town approves of if it means denying that." "But the shame," Lila said, tears welling in her eyes, "it will never go away completely. They will always whisper. Let them whisper, Jonah said. We will scream louder. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Marry me, Lila. Let us build something real. Lila looked at him. She saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the love that radiated from him like heat from a stove. She felt the walls she had built around her heart crumbling, stone by stone. Yes, she whispered. Jonah let out a breath he felt he had been holding for weeks. Yes, yes, Lila said, her voice strengthening. But on one condition. Anything. We don't just live for us, she said. We build something. That old parsonage, it is too big for two people. We turn it into a house, a refuge, for girls like Rose, for drifters who have nowhere to go. We make it a place where nobody asks for your references before they give you a meal. Jonah smiled, a slow, spreading grin that reached his eyes. A mission house. A home, Lila corrected. For the unwanted. Done, Jonah said. The wedding took place at twilight on a Tuesday. There were no invitations sent. The church was mostly empty. The setting sun slanted through the dusty windows, turning the floating motes of grit into drifting gold. Standing at the altar were Jonah and Lila. Lila wore a dress of pale blue wool, the only nice thing she owned that wasn't red silk. Jonah wore his black coat, brushed clean. The guests were few. Rose stood by Lila, weeping softly into a handkerchief. Swedish Olaf and Tom the blacksmith sat in the front pew, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best. The town marshal stood in the back, hat in his hand, and Mrs. Miller sat with Billy, beaming. It was a strange assembly, the outcasts and the saved. As they exchanged vows, the silence in the church was profound. Jonah's hand shook slightly as he slipped a simple gold band onto Lila's finger. With this ring, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I thee wed, in the sight of God and these witnesses. I claim you as my own. Lila looked at the ring. It was real gold. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't payment. I promised to walk beside you, she said, her voice breaking. In good weather and bad, in the light and in the dark. When Jonah kissed her, it was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the cabin. It was a seal, a covenant. They walked out of the church into the purple dusk. Whispers rippled through the town like wind through wheat. They did it. He actually married her. Can you believe it? In the church? Well, she did pull those boys out. A few women who had once sneered at Lila watched from their porches. They saw Lila walking past, her hand tucked into the crook of Jonah's arm. They saw the way Jonah looked down at her, as if she were the Queen of England. And for the first time, their sneers faltered. Married life in Dry Creek was not a fairy tale. The story did not end with a sunset ride. It was hard. The mission house opened a month later. At first, it was just Rose and a runaway girl from a cattle drive. But word spread. They faced anger. One morning, Lila found a dead coyote on the steps, its throat cut. Another time, someone threw a rock through the front window with the word whore painted on it. Lila stood in the kitchen, sweeping up the glass, her hands trembling. We should go, she said to Jonah. We should just go to California. They will never let us be. Jonah took the broom from her hand. He didn't speak. He just nailed a board over the window and then sat her down and made her tea. We are staying, he said. This is just noise. Lila. The nights were hard too. Lila would wake up screaming, the memory of the dark tunnel or the branding iron vivid in her mind. She would thrash, fighting off invisible hands. Jonah would be there instantly. He would pull her close, holding her tightly until her breathing slowed. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just offered his presence. I'm here. You are safe. The mountain didn't get you, but there was joy. Pure, unguarded joy that tasted sweeter because of the bitterness around it. There was the night Lila taught Rose to read. They sat at the kitchen table by lantern light. Rose sounding out the words in Jonah's Bible. When Rose read her first full sentence, Lila laughed, a genuine bell-like sound that made Jonah look up from his sermon writing and smile. There was the night a fiddler came through town and stayed at the mission. After the guests were asleep, Jonah pushed the furniture back in the parlor, Dance with me, Mrs. Hale, he said. I don't know how to dance to this. Lila laughed. Neither do I, Jonah said. They danced clumsily in their bare feet, spinning on the rough wooden floor, holding each other up, laughing until they were breathless. And there was the intimacy, the fierce, quiet giving of themselves, in the privacy of their room, with the door locked against the world. They were not the preacher and the convert. They were just a man and a woman who had seen the worst of each other and loved it anyway. Their lovemaking was a reclamation, a way of saying that their bodies belonged to each other, not to the town, not to the past. Time is the only thing that truly scours a landscape. Years passed. The drought broke and returned, as it always did in the West. The mine eventually closed, reopened, and closed again. Caleb Barton died of a stroke, leaving his money to a distant cousin who never visited. The label Devil's Bride began to fade. It didn't disappear, but it lost its venom. It became a story told in the saloon, then a legend told to children. See that house? That's where the preacher lives. His wife. She used to be a wild one. They say she dragged 10 men out of a collapsed mine with her bare hands. They say the devil tried to claim her, but the preacher fought him for her soul. The children who grew up in Dry Creek didn't know Lila as the saloon girl. They knew her as the woman who gave them fresh bread when their fathers were out of work. They knew her as the woman who stared down the schoolmaster when he tried to cane a boy too hard. The scar on the town healed. It left a mark, but the tissue was stronger than before. 10 years later, Jonah and Lila stood on the hill overlooking the town. It was late afternoon, and the sun was painting the sky in streaks of violet and burnt orange. The air smelled of sagebrush and cooling dust. The town had grown. There were more houses now, and the church had a fresh coat of white paint. The mission house was bustling. They could see Rose, now a grown woman, hanging laundry in the yard. Jonah was older. The gray was dusting his temples, and his limp was more pronounced on damp days. Lila had lines around her eyes. The map of a life lived hard and fully. Jonah reached out and took her arm. He pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing the faint, white scar on her forearm, not from a brand, but from where the rocks had cut her in the tunnel. He traced it with his thumb. Do you remember? He asked softly. Lila looked down at the town. I remember the heat, she said. I remember the iron glowing. They still call you that sometimes. Jonah said, the old ones, the Devil's Bride. Lila smiled. It was a calm, weathered smile. Let them, she said. It's just a name. Jonah shook his head. If anyone calls you that again, I will tell them the truth. And what is the truth? Reverend? Lila asked, teasing him gently. Jonah looked at her. The truth is that you were the one who saved a preacher's life, and you taught him what love really is. You are not the Devil's Bride. Lila, you are the woman who walked into hell to bring the light. Lila leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Her eyes were wet, but her gaze was steady as she looked out at the vast, unforgiving horizon. We saved each other. Jonah, she whispered. The wind picked up, tugging at their clothes, carrying the scent of rain from the distant mountains. The church bell rang faintly below, calling the town to evening prayer. Jonah put his arm around her, pulling her close against the chill. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the edge of the world. They were no longer the saint and the sinner. They were just two stubborn, flawed souls who had chosen love over fear in the wild, harsh west. And as the stars began to bleed into the sky, they turned and walked back down the hill, toward the lights of home, together. Thank you for listening to this story. I would love to hear your thoughts on Jonah and Lila's journey. Did their struggle for redemption resonate with you? Please leave a comment below, letting me know where you are listening from. And if you enjoyed this Wild West love story, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales from the frontier.